The letter had no return address, just my name, my street, spelled correctly even though the county renamed our road 11 years ago, which meant whoever sent it had known this address before the renaming or had gone out of their way to find the old one. I almost threw it out with the flyers. Then I saw the signature at the bottom, under 3 short paragraphs I didn't understand yet. Still your bug. Nobody has called me Bug in 22 years. Nobody alive, anyway. That was my brother Daniel's name for me. From back when he was 11, and I was 7. And he decided I followed him around too much to be called by my actual name. He died, or I was told he died, in a car accident on a rain-soaked highway outside Spokane when he was 26 years old. Closed casket. I helped choose the flowers. I stood in my kitchen holding that letter for 11 minutes before I could make myself sit down. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why I didn't call the police. I didn't call my parents. I did something much quieter and much more careful. Because if there was even a chance this was real, I wasn't going to be the reason it fell apart. My name is James. I'm 43 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've carried a very specific, very quiet kind of grief. The kind that doesn't announce itself at anniversaries or holidays anymore, but sits underneath everything. A low hum you stop noticing until something reaches in and turns the volume back up. Daniel was my only sibling, 6 years older, which meant for most of our childhood he was less a peer and more a small, occasionally reluctant guardian. The one who taught me to ride a bike after our father gave up on the lesson in frustration. The one who let me tag along to places I was technically too young for. The one who gave me the nickname Bug when I was 7 because, in his words, I was small, annoying, and impossible to get rid of. I loved him more than I loved almost anyone. He left for college at 18. Came back changed the way people sometimes do. More distant, more restless, chasing something none of us in the family ever fully understood. By his mid-20s, he drifted into a life we only heard about secondhand. Some construction work, some time spent out west, phone calls that came less and less frequently, always warm when they happened, always followed by longer silences than the last. The last real conversation I had with him was 3 weeks before he died. He called me, actually called, not just a text, and told me he was thinking about coming home for a while. Something in his voice sounded tired in a way I didn't fully understand at 21 years old. I told him I'd love that. I told him our mother would cry from happiness. He laughed and said, "Tell her not to get her hopes up yet, Bug. Still figuring some things out." 3 weeks later, a police officer from a county I'd never heard of called our house to tell my parents that a car registered to Daniel had been found overturned off a rain-slicked stretch of highway outside Spokane, Washington. The driver had been thrown from the vehicle. Identification at the scene, combined with dental records requested afterward, confirmed it was him. The body had been in the elements for approximately 2 days before it was discovered, which the officer explained gently was why my parents were advised against viewing him before the funeral. Closed casket. A obituary I helped write with hands that didn't feel entirely attached to my body. A grave, 22 years old now, that I still visit twice a year, on his birthday and on the anniversary. I tell you all of this so you understand exactly what I was holding in my hands when I read the words, "Still your bug," at the bottom of a letter that arrived, out of nowhere, on an ordinary Tuesday. I want to walk you through exactly what that letter said, because I've read it so many times since that I could recite it in my sleep, and because I think the specific details matter more than the broad emotional strokes. It was handwritten, not typed. 3 paragraphs. Careful, deliberate penmanship that looked almost nothing like the hurried scrawl I remembered from Daniel's old birthday cards. But handwriting changes over 22 years, and grief doesn't leave much room for confident forensic analysis. The first paragraph apologized. Not vaguely, specifically for the 22 years and for letting you bury someone who wasn't me. The second paragraph explained in broad strokes that he'd gotten involved with people in Spokane he shouldn't have. That the man in that car wasn't a stranger, but someone connected to the same dangerous situation Daniel had been trying, unsuccessfully, to extract himself from. And that faking his own death, using a body that already existed under tragic circumstances unrelated to Daniel's choices, had felt, at the time, like the only way out that didn't get someone else in our family hurt. The third paragraph was the shortest. It said he was sick. Seriously sick. The specifics deliberately vague. And that before anything happened to him for real this time, he needed me to know the truth. Needed, if I was willing, to see me one more time. It asked me not to tell our parents yet. It asked me to write back to a P.O. box in a town 2 states away if I wanted to respond, and asked me gently to trust that he'd explain everything else in person. And then, still your bug. I want to ask you something because I think it's the real center of this story. What would you do with a letter like that? Not what would you want to believe. What would you actually carefully do? Because I think most people, in the raw emotional flood of a moment like that, would either dismiss it instantly as cruel or impossible, or believe it instantly, completely, and drive to that P.O. box the very next morning. I did neither. And I think that decision, the choice to sit in the uncertainty instead of resolving it immediately in either direction, is the reason this story ends the way it does. I didn't call our parents. This was, I want to be honest, the hardest part of the entire 6 weeks that followed. Harder even than what eventually came next. My mother has never fully recovered from Daniel's death. The kind of grief that doesn't heal so much as reorganize itself around a permanent absence. If this letter turned out to be real, she deserved to know as soon as it was safe to tell her. But if it turned out to be a cruel manipulation, a scam, a con targeting grieving families, which I'd read about happening to other people and never imagined could happen to me, telling her first and being wrong would have been a second death, almost as devastating as the first. I didn't write back immediately either, though every instinct in me wanted to. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I called an old friend from college, Priya, who'd become a private investigator almost by accident after years working in insurance fraud investigation, the kind of work that teaches you to be deeply professionally suspicious of exactly the kind of emotional windfall this letter represented. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated more than I could say at the time. And when I finished, she asked me one question that reframed the entire situation for me. Do you want me to find out if it's true? Or do you want me to help you believe it's true? I sat with that question for a long moment before answering. I told her I wanted the truth, whatever it turned out to be, even if the truth was cruelty rather than a miracle. Priya's first move was quiet and methodical. She traced the P.O. box, not to open it or interfere with it, but simply to identify what town it was registered in, and cross-reference that against any public records for a man matching Daniel's approximate age, health situation, and known aliases from the original police report 22 years earlier. She also carefully reached out to a contact she had in Washington State's Vital Records Office to request, quietly, whether the original 2003 identification of the accident victim had ever been formally reopened, challenged, or flagged for review at any point in the 22 years since. This is the part of the story I think matters most. And I want to slow down here. Closed casket identifications from that era, especially in cases involving significant physical trauma and a body exposed to the elements for an extended period, sometimes relied more heavily than people realize on circumstantial evidence. A matching vehicle, matching personal effects, dental records that in rural counties with limited forensic budgets weren't always cross-checked with the same rigor a bigger city might apply. It didn't mean the original identification was wrong. It meant it wasn't impossible that it had been. Priya found something within 11 days that changed the entire shape of what I was dealing with. The P.O. box was registered under a name I didn't recognize, Marcus Whitfield, but registered using a secondary contact phone number that, when cross-referenced through a database Priya had access to from her fraud investigation work, connected back to a prepaid phone account originally activated in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, roughly 90 minutes from where the 2003 accident occurred. More importantly, and this is the detail that stopped me cold when Priya read it to me over the phone. Buried in a set of court records from a minor civil matter in 2019, a dispute over a storage unit. Nothing dramatic. The same Marcus Whitfield had listed as an emergency contact, a name that meant nothing to the court clerk who filed the paperwork, but meant everything to me. My mother's maiden name, followed by the small, specific detail of her middle name, Louise. A detail that had never once, as far as I could find, appeared anywhere in any public record associated with our family. It wasn't something a stranger running a con could have simply looked up. It was something only someone who'd actually grown up in our house, who'd actually heard my mother introduce herself using her full name at church functions decades ago, would think to write down. I sat with that information for 2 full days before deciding what to do next. Not because I doubted it anymore, but because I understood suddenly the size of what I was about to walk into. If this was real, my brother had spent 22 years alive, in hiding, while our family buried an empty casket and carried a grief that, however genuine, had been built on an absence that didn't need to exist the way it did. I wrote back to the P.O. box, 3 sentences. I told him I'd received the letter. I told him I wanted the truth, in person, before anything else happened. And I told him because I couldn't help myself that Bug still remembered. He asked to meet at a diner 2 states away, a place chosen, I think, specifically because it was public, neutral, and far enough from either of our current lives that neither of us would recognize anyone else in the room. I brought Priya, not inside. She waited in the parking lot, in her car, with instructions to call the police immediately if I texted a single specific word, a small safety measure that felt both absurd and completely necessary given everything I still didn't know for certain. I recognized him the moment I walked in, and I want to describe that recognition carefully. because it wasn't cinematic the way you'd expect. It wasn't an instant flood of certainty. It was slower than that. A gradual, quiet click of features I hadn't seen in over 2 decades resolving themselves against a face 22 years older, thinner than I remembered, marked by something in his eyes that looked less like the restless 26-year-old I'd lost, and more like someone who'd spent 2 decades being careful in ways I couldn't yet fully understand. We sat for almost 3 hours. He told me the fuller version of what the letter had only sketched. That the man in the car that night had been someone Daniel had gotten dangerously entangled with financially, someone whose death, in the chaos and confusion of that accident, created an opportunity Daniel took out of genuine, immediate fear for his life, rather than any coldly calculated plan. He told me he'd spent years afterward in a kind of self-imposed exile, working under different names, terrified that resurfacing at any point would put not just himself, but our entire family in danger from the people he'd been running from. He told me about the illness. Real. Confirmed by records Priya later quietly verified through channels she never fully explained to me and I never fully asked about. Something slow-moving, but ultimately serious enough that, facing his own mortality honestly for the first time in over 2 decades, he'd finally understood that dying twice, once officially and once in truth, without ever telling his family the difference, was a cruelty he couldn't carry any further. I asked him the question that had been sitting underneath everything since that first letter arrived. Why now? Why not 5 years ago? Or 10? Once whatever danger he'd been running from had presumably faded. He told me the truth, and it was smaller and sadder than any explanation I'd imagined. Fear becomes a habit long before it becomes a genuine, active threat. Every year that passed made the idea of resurfacing feel more impossible, not less. Because it meant admitting not just that he'd survived, but that he'd chosen, for years afterward, to let us keep grieving him, rather than face what coming back would actually cost him emotionally. It wasn't danger that kept him away in the end. It was shame. Compounding the same way debt or dishonesty compounds in any of the other quiet family stories you've probably heard before, just measured in decades instead of dollars.
We told our parents together, 3 weeks after that first diner meeting. Once I'd had time to verify what I could verify, and once Daniel and I had spent enough hours together, carefully, rebuilding some fragile version of trust neither of us fully expected to feel again. I won't try to describe my mother's reaction in a way that does it justice, because I don't think words fully capture what it looks like when someone's deepest, most permanent grief turns out to have been unnecessary for 22 years. There was joy in it, overwhelming joy. But there was something else, too, a kind of grief underneath the joy, mourning the 22 years of visits to a grave that never needed visiting, the 22 years of a hole in our family that could have, in some alternate version of this story, been filled decades sooner. My father, quieter by nature, simply held Daniel for a long time without saying much of anything at all. Some reunions don't need narration. Daniel's illness is being treated now, aggressively, with a medical team my mother researched with the same fierce, protective energy she once poured into planning his funeral. The prognosis is uncertain, honestly, the way these things often are. But uncertain is an entirely different weight to carry than gone, and our family has spent the months since relearning how to hold that particular kind of hope. I think about that letter often, sitting in the kitchen drawer where I still keep it, and I think about the 11 minutes I spent standing at my counter before I could make myself sit down and read it properly. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this story, it's this. The truth, even when it arrives 22 years late, even when it's tangled up in fear and shame and decades of silence, is almost always worth the careful, patient work of uncovering it fully before you decide how to feel about it. I could have thrown that letter away as a cruel hoax. I could have believed it instantly and driven 2 states away without a single question asked. Instead, I sat in the uncomfortable middle for 6 weeks, and that discomfort, that refusal to resolve the uncertainty too quickly in either direction, is the only reason I got my brother back, instead of either losing him a second time to my own fear or handing my trust to someone who might not have deserved it. Bug remembered. And it turns out, so did he. Every single year he stayed away, carrying a truth he was too afraid to bring home, until fear of dying without ever telling it finally outweighed the fear of what telling it might cost. Some things, it turns out, aren't gone just because we buried them. Sometimes they're only waiting for the moment we're finally brave enough and careful enough to let them come home.